now, over the next 3 weeks, we're going to do a little Christmas series as we do every year. Christmas, for many pastors, is a time to dread because every year, there's no other series. You know, on Easter, you do an Easter sermon or whatever, but there's no other topic or series that you have to hit every single year for almost an entire month. Knowing that many people are coming to church, on the one hand, expect that you will do something about Christmas or they will be upset. And two, daring you not to bore them because you have to do the exact same message topic and series on the same topic that you always do. So we're going to do it again this year. But I want to take a little bit I want to help you have a fresh look on Christmas. And we're going to pull back the curtain a little bit. And I want to go back. The way I want to start this series, I think you're going to see some fresh new things about Christmas, but also hopefully to apply it to your life. So we're going to start with some perspective stuff at the beginning of this sermon. At the end of it, it's going to become incredibly practical for your life. But I want to start by asking this question, a question we don't often ask. What would a first century Christian, so we're in the 21st century, what would a first century Christian have known about the Christmas story? Now, that's not a question most of us as Christians ask, because we just assume they would have known the same thing we do. What do you mean, what would a first century Christian have known about the Christmas story? They would have known the same things we know. Except the question is, how do we know the Christmas story? How do we know the Christmas story? We know it, now it's so saturated into our culture, it's kind of everywhere. But the way we know the Christmas story is it's in here, it's in the Bible, specifically in 2 of the Gospels. And we'll elaborate on that in just a little bit. But we know it because it's in the Bible. Now, here's the thing about the Bible that we often don't think about, particularly with regards to the first couple of centuries of history, is that this book that we take for granted and that we know the Christmas story and so many other important stories we know from this book, is that this book did not magically appear after Jesus died, rose again, and went to heaven. It's not like Jesus died on the cross, went into the grave, rose, went back to heaven, and presto, everybody had an NIV, an ESV, a KJV. They didn't even know English back then, but already they had our Bibles. And presto, every early Christian had a Bible. Obviously, that did not happen. The moment I even say it, we just don't think about it. But the moment I say it, you go, oh yeah, I guess that totally makes sense. But it's even a bigger issue than, even after I say that, it's even a bigger issue than what we think. Because it took a while for this book, and particularly I'm talking about the New Testament, to come together. So the first thing you have to understand, right? So I'm just setting the table a little bit, because this question is going to become very important for what messages actually we can draw from the Christmas story. But the first thing you need to know about a little bit of Bible history here is the books of the New Testament were written over about a 50-plus year period. It's over 50 years. All right? So it's a number of decades. It's more than 50. Depending on which scholars you talk to, it could be up to, 70 or 80 years. But it's probably closer, to 60, but it's more than 50 years for all the letters of the New Testament to get written. All right? Now, the problem, though, is even much bigger than that. So, but even just think about that for a moment. So there is a period of time during which the books of the New Testament are getting written. During that 50-plus years, people don't have all of these books. And so lots of the things that we take for granted, they couldn't have known. But there's an even bigger problem than the fact that it took over 50 years for all the letters to be written. The second problem is, it also took, it's not just like the moment a new letter got written. So Paul writes a new letter, and everybody checks their phone the next morning, and I just got an update. My New Testament just got a new book. It took a long time, so even after, Paul writes a letter. Let's say Paul writes a letter. And by the way, you'll notice I'm starting to use the word letter right away. If I had been able to fit it with the graphics, I wanted to put a big X over books. Because nobody, the authors of the New Testament didn't think they were writing a book of the Bible. Like Paul didn't say, for example, the 1 Corinthians. Paul does not sit down, the Apostle Paul didn't sit down and say, time to write a book of the Bible, and let's call this 1 Corinthians. That's not how the New Testament authors, they didn't realize they were writing Scripture. Right? So why was Paul writing? These are letters. So Paul would hear of a problem. There would be a problem. There's a church fighting, church splits, questions. He hears a problem from a specific church, and he's like, oh, I got to write a letter. And he sends off a letter. And he wrote piles of letters that didn't even make it into our Bible, that many of them are lost to history. Right? But he would write these, so he would write a letter, send it off. Now, some of those letters would get copied and passed around. And as Christians, we would say we see the work of the Holy Spirit in that. That certain letters that God wanted to end up in the Bible, those are the ones that the church is copying more, passing around. But it takes a long time. So if he writes one to Corinth, the church in Corinth, the Roman Empire is a huge empire. It surrounds the Mediterranean Ocean. If you're in a different part of the empire, you're not going to see that letter for decades probably. Could be a century. And during that whole time, you are missing out on information that we now as modern Christians take for granted because we just wake up and have a Bible. And we don't think about this often because we just assume the first Christians had all the same information we do. All right? But they didn't. So let me put this. I like graphics. So for those of you who care, I think this is cool. And you don't have to. Oh, dang. Forgot the question. Anyway, here we go. So it actually takes about 150 plus years. You say, when did the first list? So we have 27 books in our New Testament. When does the first list that's close, not exactly the same, but when does the first list that's close to our list of 27, when do we see that first list spread through, a majority of the churches? In about 280, 280. That's about 150 years after Jesus. So notice this. So you're looking at up there. You've got about, 50, 60 years where these letters are being written. Then it takes another 100 years for them to kind of spread everywhere and be accepted. And during this whole time, there's all kinds of other letters and gospels that are spreading around that are getting cut out or argued with or whatever. And then you don't need to remember all of this. Again, this is just to give you a little sense of the problem. Because remember, in this time, during this whole time period, this 150 years, if you're just some Christian in the Roman Empire, you might have one gospel. You might have the Gospel of Mark, and this will be very important for the Christmas story in just a moment. You might have one gospel, but you don't have Luke, in which case your idea about what the Christmas story is going to be incredibly different. That's just a little spoiler. You might have no gospels, in which case your idea of what the Christmas story is going to be very different. That's a long period of time. In fact, by the way, this list, so this is 150 years for this first list, and this list was still missing 8 really important books from the New Testament. The book of Revelation, we just did a series on James. If you were a Christian in the first 150 years after Jesus, there's a good chance you hadn't seen the letter to James, or from James, and if you had, it was a disputed book, and a lot of people were saying, this should not be in the Bible. Same with Hebrews and Revelation, and 1st and 2nd Peter, and a few other ones, all right? So to get the whole New Testament the way we see it now actually takes 300 years, all right? Now people, after about 150 years, they mostly kind of have, most churches kind of mostly have what we have, but it's 300 years basically from Jesus till you get a New Testament like ours. Now, this has big implications for what people thought about the Christmas story. Because if you're missing parts of the Christmas story, you don't know it the way we do, and we just mash it all together and just assume we know what the Christmas story is because we put together all these different things, and many of these people were missing some of those various things. Now, by the way, interesting thing, what does that say about God that he would allow this kind of confusion to go on for so long? Like, have you ever thought about how us as Western Christians, we have gotten very much like, believe this, and this, and if you disagree with me on this, you're out. You're out of the group. You're most likely on your way to hell because you don't agree with me on this or that. And in the first 300 years, you actually have a lot of chaos in the early church. What does it tell you about God? Tells me he's probably a little less concerned with getting all our doctrine right than we are, by the way. Because if he was that concerned about it, there would have been a magical Bible, 33 AD. Jesus goes back to heaven, boom, everybody wakes up with a full New Testament. But now, what does this have to do with the Christmas story specifically? Okay, well, here, let me drop another little bombshell on you. Paul, let me ask you this as a question. What do you think? And you're allowed to look at your Bibles, which includes on your phone, if you want. Just don't ask ChatGPT for the right answer. Don't cheat. New Testament. What was the first letter of the New Testament that was written? Which one do you think? Anybody have a guess? You're probably going to be wrong. You have a guess? Now, most of us would say Matthew, right? So I'll save you being wrong, because we would say Matthew, because what's the first letter in our New Testament is what? Matthew. Matthew is not the first letter written. You say, well, then it must be Mark. Well, you'd be right that Mark was written before Matthew, but you'd still be wrong. Well, it's got to be Luke or John. Nope, and nope. The first letter of the Bible to be written was Galatians. How many of you would have guessed Galatians? Not many of you. Because it's the ninth one in our New Testament. So if you're in the New Testament, Galatians is this little book. It's certainly none of our favorites. It's not the most popular. It's not the most famous. And it's the ninth one in order. We have the 4 Gospels and Acts. Those, for most of us, are our favorites, except for the weird people who really like Revelations. And that usually has to do with a personality disorder of some kind. But anyway, Galatians is the first letter of the New Testament that was written. In fact, okay, now again, think about that. Because here's the next thing you have to know. In fact, all of Paul's letters were written before all of the Gospels. Let me just put this up for you so you can see it. Most of us don't realize this because we just assume the Gospels are at the front of the New Testament, therefore the Gospels were written first. Actually, no. The Gospels were all written after Paul was already dead. Now think about that. So Paul's letters are written from about 48 AD, so, 20 years or so after Jesus, and then they're written over the course of, about 10 or 15 years into the early 60s. The first gospel written is Mark, and the Gospels are all written right from around where the temple is destroyed in 70 AD till sometime towards the end of the first century. All right? But now I want you to think about being an early Christian. So what does this have to do with the Christmas story? Well, interestingly enough, you say, okay, well, what parts of the Christmas story, let's say I'm a Christian living in some of these 40 years here, where only Paul has written anything, and I don't even have all of Paul, because it takes forever for his letters to get everywhere. But let's just imagine I'm living in these first 40 years after Jesus here, and I have all of Paul's letters, which is very unlikely, but let's say I do. I have all of Paul's letters. How much would I know about the Christmas story? How much would I know? Yes, 0. Now, I want you to think about how weird that is. We Christians glaze over lots of very weird stuff in the Bible and never stop to comment on the fact that that is weird. Think about all the things Paul talks about. Women wearing caps when they pray, fighting in various churches, all kinds of doctrine, sin, lots about the resurrection. Obviously, that's the most important thing. That's one of the things we learn from all of this. And Jesus' death and who he is and all that sort of stuff. Not one thing about a virgin birth. You would think, is that not weird? Like, imagine you're Paul and your whole life is to convince people that Jesus is the Messiah. Wouldn't your whole thing is Jesus was not just a man, he was God. Now, if you're making the claim that a man, lots of people knew about a man, but they just didn't know that this man was also God. If you were trying to convince everybody that this man, Jesus, is God, and he was born supernaturally of a virgin, and angels told people that he was going to be the Son of God, wouldn't you think that would be very helpful to your case? Like, it's very strange. It's kind of a big story. Like, we just kind of, oh yeah, Paul never mentions Jesus being born of a virgin. It's kind of a big deal, isn't it? And you say, certainly you have an answer for us as to why this is. Nobody has an answer. Paul doesn't have a footnote saying, by the way, this is kind of a big deal, and someone will ask a question about it at some point, but I'm not talking about it. Scholars debate why it is. I mean, there's only two possibilities. One is he didn't know about it. That makes us all feel a little queasy. The other thing is he just thinks it's such a little deal that he'll talk about hundreds of other things and not that, which also is a bit strange. But whatever the case, you have Christians living for decades who have, if you're born somewhere in the Roman Empire, like you weren't one of the few who was born right close to Jerusalem and happened to know Jesus and their family, you don't know about a virgin birth or wise men or shepherds or mangers or any of the Christmas story for decades. How many of you think those Christians are still going to be in heaven? Some of you are not sure. They're going to hell. They don't affirm the virgin birth of Christ. By the way, kind of a big piece of doctrine, no? Like if someone today would go on TikTok, for example, and say Jesus wasn't born of a virgin, which of course we would disagree with them, but most of us say, a lot of Christians say, heretic! You're going to be in heaven with a whole bunch of first century Christians who had no idea. They're going to be in heaven, and then Jesus is going to say, by the way, everybody, I was born of a virgin, and a whole bunch of Christians are just going to plop. They didn't have a Bible. They didn't know. All right? So, but it gets even weirder than that. It gets even weirder than the fact that Paul never mentions something that we think would be. He never mentions Mary or Joseph. Like, he just mentions nothing about any of it. But it gets weirder than that because even within the Gospels, pretty strange that what? I keep missing my own slides. Pretty strange that if you're going to write a life biography of Jesus, like if I'm going to write a biography of a famous sports player or politician, and they were born of a virgin, that makes it into all the biographies. His death and resurrection, again, make it into all of them. So again, we see the priority of the New Testament writers. His birth only makes it into half. And by the way, now again, our New Testaments put Matthew first, so we assume that's based on some church tradition stuff, which is pretty weak in terms of its argumentation. Pretty much all scholars agree this is the order of the Gospels were written in, and about the timing. So Mark is the first Gospel written. There's no birth story. Do you know what Mark's story starts with? I'm going to go there. I'm going to show you actually in just a second. But let's just stop and think about this for just 1 second. You're a first century Christian. Let's take away all of our modern, we know everything, and we just assume everybody has always known these things. Let's say you're one of those first century Christians and you're living just before 80 AD. So you're like 50 years after Jesus. There's a whole bunch of Christians around the Roman Empire by this time. And you only have some of Paul's letters. And let's say you're one of the lucky people to have Mark's gospel. Not even everybody has that. But let's say you're one of the lucky Christians who has Mark's gospel. So you even think you have the whole story of Jesus' life. And if someone asks that person, tell me about Jesus being born of a virgin, there are whole churches who have Mark, and they have no idea Jesus is born of a virgin. And by the way, this has some theological implications historically, which I'm going to show you. But let me show you, what would Mark start with then if he doesn't start with a birth story? Well, let's go look. Here's Mark, first gospel. The beginning of the good news about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. Now, if I had read you this verse 10 minutes ago, before I told you all this stuff, most of us would think a Christmas story is about to follow. Because what else could the beginning of the good news about Jesus Messiah, what else could the beginning be? Well, in Mark's case, he spends the next 7 verses explaining how John the Baptist was preparing the way for something big from God. And then the first thing he says about Jesus is this. At that time, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. The first thing, and we all go, what? I mean, this is a famous story. It's in all the Gospels. But Why, by the way, also weird, why would the baptism story be in all 4 Gospels and the birth story only be in 2? That doesn't go according to how we evaluate the importance of certain passages and certain stories. But now I want you just to imagine now, again, you're one of these Christians. There's 50 years, there's 100 years, there's 150 years before everybody has all 4 Gospels. So there are many Christians who are living in a long period of time where this might be all they know about Jesus' life. It starts with the baptism. What might you think about Jesus being God? What might you think about Jesus being God? Well, let me show you. Because Mark says some interesting things about Jesus being God in his baptism. Just as Jesus was coming out of the water, he saw heaven being torn open and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. A story. Again, but we always read this story assuming background information that isn't given in Mark. And what does Mark say next? So the first thing Mark says is Jesus gets baptized by John. He comes out of the water, the Spirit descends on him, and then what? And a voice came from heaven, "You are my Son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased." Now, interesting, modern Christians, we read that and we don't even blink because we fill in information from Matthew and Luke, and we say, oh, yeah, but he was virgin born, and the angels talked, and blah, 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 blah. But now let's imagine that you only have Mark. You might be forgiven for thinking that Jesus became God when he was baptized. I'm not saying that's what Mark believed. I don't think Mark believed that. But we know from history that lots of Christians who had read Mark did think that. Lots of Christians who only had Mark or had less than Mark thought Jesus became God at his baptism. Now that sounds an awful lot like heresy to me. How many of you think those Christians are going to be in heaven? Raise your hand. Again, not all of you are sure. I am so glad some of you are not God. Wrong. Judgment. What does this tell us about God? That he would allow this. Why would he not say to Mark, Mark, you are the first gospel that's going to be in the New Testament. I need you to put the whole thing in there. He lets him write it and start with the baptism. In fact, it's probably a big part of it. Now, I'm getting lost here, and I don't know what screen is coming next, so I'm just going to check quickly. Yes. So, this is probably a big part of the reason why Matthew and Luke are writing their Gospels and why they both want to include the Christmas story is they're actually combating an idea that is widespread that Jesus became God at his baptism. All right, so here's one really important. Oh yeah, right. Yeah, no, that's good. Let's go to Luke. Sometimes I get a bit confused. My wife would say it's more than a little bit, but anyway. So let's go to Luke now, because this is probably a chunk of why Matthew and Luke, as I just said before, this is probably a chunk of why Matthew and Luke are writing their Gospels and why they're including the Christmas story, is because they want everybody to know that Jesus was not a man who became God at his baptism. They want everybody to know that he was God right from the beginning, right from conception, he was God. So look at how obvious Luke is making this, so that we don't make the mistake. And remember, but Luke is only being written like 10 or 20 years after Mark. So the angel comes and says to Mary, you're going to have a baby. And she says, how can this be since I am a virgin? And then the angel answered, well, the Holy Spirit will come on you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. So the Holy One to be born will be called the Son of God. Now again, we take this line very, very for granted. But you have to realize that in the first century, this is 50 years after Jesus, tons of letters of the New Testament have been written, tons. All of Paul's, Mark and Matthew have been written. And this is now Matthew also hits at the same point, but this is the most clear statement yet. Tons of the New Testament has been written, and we're 50 years plus after Jesus' resurrection, and this is the first time we get a clear statement that right from conception, he's God. This is a key part of why they're being written. By the way, one more time, I want to say one more thing with the early church, and then we'll just keep moving with this. Do you know how often throughout my pastoral career that I have said or I have heard other people say? You know, us pastors, us Christians, we often are talking about going back to the beginning. We have this idea that the early church was a paradise. Everybody was sharing everything. Everybody believed the right stuff. It was just this amazing revival of church. If we could only get the modern church back to what the first church was. So, I'll just let you in on a little secret, is that the early church was not a paradise. The early church was actually quite human, just like the modern church. It was filled with splinter groups, infighting, doctrinal disagreements, everybody getting it wrong. There was actually very little unity. In fact, we should thank God for all the disunity in the early church, because that's why we have the New Testament. Most of these books got written as letters because people were fighting and couldn't figure things out. If they'd all had unity and kumbaya, they wouldn't have needed in the New Testament. We got these letters because everybody was fighting and there was lots of ignorance. And actually, if I'm honest, that makes me feel a lot better. We shouldn't try to go back and be the first early church. We're lucky to have all of the letters and the books of the New Testament. So, this would have been a big reveal for some Christians. So, one of the big things about the Christmas story that we need to appreciate in a fresh new light as modern Christians is that a big part of the reason for the Christmas story is exactly this point. Matthew and Luke want us to know that the story of Jesus' life is a story about God becoming a man, not a man becoming God. That's a big part of the reason, because before Matthew and Luke were written, even for many Christians, this wasn't totally clear. And yet, they were still Christians, which I think is a really good thing for us to meditate on. But not that it's not important today for us to get it right, but that's why these books are being written. But there's something else here. You say, well, who would really believe? What was going on in the first century that people would think, that so many people would think that a man, a regular human being, could become God? What kind of a strange culture were they living in? Why was this even a big deal? Like now in our modern Christian culture, it's just obvious. A man can't become God. Clearly, Jesus has to be about God becoming a man. What's happening in the first century? Well, in the first century, there were actually lots of stories of men, people, usually men, who through heroic actions or various rituals or accidents of fate or whatever, literally became God. In their minds, not in actuality, but in their minds, there were lots of stories in the first century about people who ascended and became God. There was a very, very famous one that Luke in particular has specifically in mind. It was everywhere in the Roman Empire about a man who had become God, right? He's one of the two most famous Roman emperors of all time. Here's a statue of him, obviously not a photo. Does anybody know who this is? This is one of the two most famous. There's like the two most famous Roman leaders of all time. This is the first emperor. Does anybody have a guess? Just throw it out there. Okay, that is an excellent guess, and it's the other one. I knew someone. Augustus. This is, okay, but yes, that was a good guess. Julius Caesar and Augustus, those are the two most famous ones. So, two of you know a little bit of history, and the rest of you do now. So this is Caesar Augustus. He ruled Rome. This is like, he was the first one to be an emperor of Rome. Before this, Rome was a republic. he's the first one to be an emperor. And he ruled exactly, notice this, 27 BC to 14 AD. Jesus is born, some were right around 0 AD, probably actually several years before, but that's a whole other thing. But he ruled all of Rome right when Jesus was born and during Jesus' growing up years. Right? So Caesar Augustus is the guy right when Jesus is being born and growing up. Now, interesting thing about Caesar Augustus is that he was declared, after he died in 14 AD, he was actually officially declared a god by the Roman Senate. They built temples. This is just one. There's temples all over the Roman Empire. Many of them are still standing. This is in southeastern France. It's just the best picture I could get of one, but there's like a dozen of them still with ruins or standing around the Roman Empire. They built temples to him. And the Roman Senate, the government actually said, he is a god. He was one of the most impressive leaders. They also put his face on coins that said, Divus Augustus Pater. That's God. Augustus, the God Augustus, Father. Father God Augustus. By the way, any of that sound familiar to you? They literally called him the coins. Many Christians in the first century are using coins that say, imagine if we had money that said, Mark Carney, God. Easy now. Pierre Polyev, God. Donald Trump, God. Some Christians might even, but well, we won't go there. These Christians have money. It says he's God. All right? Because he was an amazing leader. He earned his divinity by being one of the most brilliant Roman leaders of all time. And he was particularly famous for bringing peace and prosperity to the Roman Empire. He was so successful in his military campaigns. He also revolutionized and reorganized the way Roman government worked. And he was hugely instrumental in all the famous Roman roads that were built. For 200 years after he died, he basically set it up. He was such a good leader that the Roman Empire had a relative amount of peace and prosperity for about 2 centuries after he died. And so they venerate him. This guy is amazing. We believe he's a god. He became divine. God's powers are working through him. Look at this. And Luke has him specifically in mind. Look at this. So chapter 2, verse 1, this is in the Christmas story. Luke is writing decades after he's done, but Luke wants us specifically thinking about Caesar Augustus. Look at this. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree. There he is. There is the very man himself, that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. Now, here's a first century inscription. You have to understand this Christmas story is a direct comparison of 2 men who in the first century in people's minds, both were God. One was Augustus, a man who became God. One is God become man. But here's an inscription from the first century, right around the time when Jesus was born. You can see this actually in a museum in Germany, which I have not been to, but I have looked at pictures online. But here's what the inscription says. This was a governor in the Roman province of Asia, which is where actually many of the churches that Paul wrote to were in the province where this inscription was made. So we know the Christians were exposed to this. Providence has given us Augustus, that he might benefit humankind, sending him as a what? Sound familiar? That's what we talk about Jesus. Both for us and for our descendants, that he might end war. He was known as the one who brought peace. Finishes with this. Since the birthday of the god Augustus was the beginning of the good tidings. By the way, the Greek word there is euangelion, which is where we get our word evangelism. It's the exact same word used in all the Gospels, euangelion, for good tidings of Jesus. But here it is about Augustus, for the world that came by reason of him. Like literally, lots of the Christian words in the Gospels that we use for Jesus were literally taken straight from Caesar Augustus himself. This is what the Roman government, this is the propaganda on the coins and the temples. This is the propaganda for Caesar Augustus. And the gospel writers are saying, no. This is not, the real deal is not a man who became God. It's the God who became man in Jesus. And it's a whole reversal. The Christmas story is a reversal of this Augustus propaganda in the Roman Empire. And this is such a key thing that we have to understand about the Christmas story. You say, well, okay, all of this is very cool. It kind of makes the stories pop. One of the things I would encourage many of you to do this week, even as you're thinking about this, if you want to do a little homework, is actually go and read the first 2 chapters of each of the 4 Gospels. So Matthew and Luke. Next week we're going to compare Matthew and Luke because the way they tell the Christmas story is very different. But I would encourage you this week, take some time this week and read the first 2 chapters of each of the 4 Gospels. But try to set yourself back to a first century Christian and try to read each one as if you didn't have the others. And see what kind of insights, what kind of things God might have been trying to say to those early Christians who had those. But behind these Christmas stories looms this figure of Caesar Augustus. You say, well, okay, that's really neat. It kind of makes the Christmas story pop. How do we apply it to our lives today? And there are, there's a dozen ways we could go. Literally, there's, every Christmas we could bring new applications out of this. But one of the things I was thinking of today that I think is very, very practical for each of us in our relationships, our families, how we exist in the world today. One of the practical applications of knowing this about Caesar Augustus and Jesus in the Christmas story is how we get peace matters. Because you have to understand, Augustus, in terms of how we think about history, Augustus was not a bad guy. In terms of how we think about history, we would all read the history and say, yeah, this guy was a brilliant leader. They didn't raise him up to the status of a god in their minds because he was a horrible leader or he was a butcher or any of that sort of stuff. He brought, one of the things he was most famous for was bringing peace. So you'd think, well, that's the same thing Jesus is doing. So why, if Jesus is the Prince of Peace and Augustus is bringing peace, why are the Christmas stories contrasting them? Maybe Augustus is actually just a good guy. Just tell the story of Jesus. Why do we have to have a clash between Jesus and Caesar Augustus, who's such an amazing leader who brings peace? And the answer is, and I think this is so important for us as a church as a whole, and as Christians as a whole in society, but also for each of us as individuals, is the ends does not justify the means. Caesar Augustus got some good results. He made the empire more prosperous. He made the empire more peaceful. So then we could say, oh, yeah, this is amazing. We like the way this guy leads. Actually, what the Christmas stories tell us is that it's not just that we get peace that matters. How we get peace matters. So Caesar Augustus, how did he get this peace? Well, one way he got peace was through military success. He killed his enemies. He just beat them. Well, that is one way to get peace. If you kill your enemies, you will have more peace. Internal enemies, he crucified many, many people. He killed many who opposed him. He got peace. Again, if you eliminate the people who are against you, you get peace. He enforced peace through fear, through dominance, temples, coins, fame, propaganda. It was top-down peace. And yes, there was a form of peace. But what we get from Jesus is a very different way of getting peace. In the Christmas story, we see that Jesus does not come like Caesar. He does not come in power with his face on coins, with temples, here come worship me, and look at how amazing I am. He comes as the least intimidating, What is the least intimidating thing on earth after a little baby kitten or a little baby puppy would be a baby human? That's the Christmas story, the most powerful king in the world. Augustus is going to have his peace, and he's going to give us prosperity, but he's going to give it to us through fear. You will do what I say, and then things will be better. Jesus comes as the Prince of Peace. He could do everything Augustus did times 1,000, times 1,000,000, times infinity. He's God. And instead, he comes as the least intimidating thing you could possibly be, a baby, because he doesn't want to force anyone to follow him. So what does this look like in our personal lives? How we get peace matters. Caesar peace. There will be peace as long as I'm in charge. In our parenting, in our marriages, in society, in our businesses. Now, I know some of you are thinking, oh, Kris, you're so pie in the sky. Like, this doesn't actually work. Sometimes you need to use force. I 100% agree. Society needs to put some predators in prison to keep everybody else safe. Parents, sometimes you just can't sit down and empathize. I know you want to go into the middle of the road while the truck is coming. Let's just have a little conversation. Sometimes you just have to grab them and yank them gently out of the way. I'm not saying there's never a place for strength or force, but it is like only for people's protection. So much of our parenting, so much of our, even in marriage relationships, friendships, society, is actually us trying to get peace. Well, you will agree with me. It's top-down peace. It's rules. Jesus came as a baby, the least intimidating kind of figure you could make. He comes on the Prince of Peace. As long as I'm in charge, there will be peace. That's Caesar peace. When I get my way, there will be peace. That's Caesar peace. I was at a seminar with some experts here in Manitoba. Last week, Carl was there with me too, here in the community about, and the presenters were Christian as well, but experts in the area of domestic abuse and violence and family abuse. And so there was a whole day thing. I was there for the first half of the day. They had some absolutely shocking, horrifying statistics. Not just about society, but Christians as well. They've done studies here in Manitoba, and somewhere close to 50% of Christian women have experienced some form of abuse in their marriage through. And there's also men in this. I don't want to just say it's men. The men percentage is quite a bit lower, but it does happen. It for sure happens, and I don't want to leave anyone left out. But close to 50% of women, Christian women, have experienced intimidation, verbal intimidation, physical intimidation, or physical abuse of some kind, psychology, control, power, and abuse. Close to 50%. That's within Christians. You know, the thing is, abusers are trying to get peace too. That's the thing. Everybody wants peace. Everybody wants peace in their relationship. Everybody wants peace in the country. Everybody wants peace in the business. The question is, how do we get that peace? Abusers try to get it through control and dominance. It's one way. It's not a two-way street. It's not through mutual. Authoritarian parents try to get it. And again, there's a place, you know what? You're just not allowed to do this. I'm not going to let you do that. It's for your safety. It's for all of our safety. But 90% of it should be, are you allowed to speak back into my life? Are you allowed to be critical of me? Are you allowed to say what you think? What do your feelings matter? All of this matters. That's Caesar peace, not Jesus peace. By the way, the Jesus way is far messier. 200 years. People don't even have a New Testament. It's chaos. It's doctrinal chaos. There's fighting, there's messiness, and Jesus says, I would rather have mess, but I'm not crushing them like Augustus, who had order instead of mess. Jesus would prefer mess with love than order with dominance. When I am respected and honored, when my face is on the coins, when my name is on the temple, when everybody respects me, that's when I will give peace. That's Caesar peace. Jesus came as a baby. This is the Christmas story, is the whole flipping upside down of the power and the way we use power in human relationships. It's a radical rethinking and reimagining of how the most powerful being in the universe, God, thinks about love and life in us. So, this Christmas, how can we grow in Jesus' peace as opposed to Caesar peace? So I'm going to get you to bow your head with me and close your eyes. What does Jesus coming as a baby? The opposite of someone like Caesar Augustus. He actually makes himself vulnerable to us instead of dominating us. How does that convict us in our relationships? How does that convict us in the church? So many church leaders, I've done this in the past, have used the fear of hell, the fear of discipline, fear of authority, to try to get compliance. And many Christians have been wounded through this. And we've wounded our children, and we've been wounded. And we've wounded our spouses through Caesar power. Father in heaven, would you forgive us? Help us to carry that picture, the most powerful being in the universe, Jesus, coming as the weakest form of human life, a baby. May it radically transform the way we engage in politics, the way we engage in our families, the way we engage in our marriages, Jesus. Things might get a little bit messy, but it'll be the mess of love as opposed to the order of abuse. Thank you, Jesus, for your love for us. Thank you for the Christmas story. Thanks for not being Caesar Augustus. In Jesus' name we pray. And all God's people said, amen.